Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Skybound Capital's podcast series, Under the Macroscope. Now, at the start of 2022, we decided that we'd go with a sort of fortnightly offering in the podcast, but reserve the right, if you can call it that, to go a little more regularly than that when the situation demanded. And now is one such time. In his week in review at the end of the past week, our chief strategist in the London office of Skybound Capital, WITHDRAWAL, gave a very concise and easy to understand picture of what's driving Vladimir Putin and Russia in this invasion of Ukraine and the outcome, the possible outcomes for Ukraine, for Europe, and for the world in general. And what struck me, Jabir, as we welcome you again to the podcast, is the West has said they don't want to get involved from a military perspective and that sanctions would do the trick. But the first part of your week in review suggested that sanctions won't really concern Putin that much at all.
That is right. And if you look at what happened yesterday, the EU has not applied sanctions regarding SWIFT on all the Russian banks. Okay, the two banks in question that were excluded were Sberbank and Gazprom Bank. And there's a very simple reason why. It's because Europe relies on its energy imports. So if they can't pay for Russian oil and gas, then why should Russia provide the oil and gas? Where's Europe going to get it from? And this is a serious concern. I think in this master plan, which I believe there is one, I think Putin has spent many months thinking about this, arguably since 2014 when he invaded Crimea. As I said in that weekly, I think the Russian economy has been slowly crumbling. But what's kept it afloat is the fact that the bulk of its export revenue is derived from oil and gas, followed by precious metals. And last but not least, and actually very importantly, certain agricultural products, and particularly fertilizers. What then became apparent after I wrote that article is that if you look at the countries who have abstained from voting against Russia, it includes, for instance, India. And India derives a lot of its agricultural fertilizers from Russia. So there's this intricate network. Once in an internal presentation, I showed how intricate the network is in terms of supply chains. You could almost draw up something similar here. It's such a web. But at the end of the day, I think Putin's taken a very simple, straightforward view on this. He said, what's going to drive my economy for some time to come until we completely replace hydrocarbons with alternative fuels? And it's going to be oil and gas. And that's where he's got the stranglehold. And if you look at where markets are today, oil is north of $100 a barrel. And that, by the way, was before the likes of Goldman Sachs were saying that it would get to 100 before this whole invasion started, if we can call it that. If you look at agricultural prices, particularly wheat and corn, they're going through the roof. And I did say in the article, no, there was no subtlety intended, but Russia is not going hungry. It has plenty of wheat. And if it is able to capture Ukraine in some shape or form, then together Russia and Ukraine will control nearly 30%, 29% to be exact, of the total global wheat production. So I think from potential investors' perspective, where do we go from here? Because there's no doubt that the Russian takeover of Ukraine has not gone to plan. We know that. We're hearing all kinds of stories. In fact, today, I think in the FT, there was an admission by the Russian minister that they have suffered high casualties. 498 is the figure. Now, does that mean it's 5, 10, 20 times more than that? We don't know. But for them to come out and admit that there are casualties means they're having a tough time with it. So it's really about the next steps, because what Putin has at the front of his mind is, my God, if this backfires on me, then forget Ukraine. I've got a big problem back home. And what they're trying back home in Moscow and places is to portray the news in a totally different way. Like it's all the fault of the Ukrainians. They started this. They're the ones attacking our soldiers. They are on a big PR mission. They're capturing our armored vehicles and then putting Russian signs on. Now, how long can you carry on doing that? So this is the problem that he faces. It's that end game.
It becomes an information war as much as anything, and who to believe. I was reading some analysis which I've shared with our team from Lawrence Friedman, who's a respected historian, if you can call it that, in the area. And what fascinated me in his article, in his conclusion, was he said, right now it appears that regime change in Moscow is every bit as likely as it is in Kiev, and we wait to see how this plays out. Would you concur with that?
I think ultimately that has to be a reality. And it comes back to what I just said about, you know, how Putin handles it from here is going to be critical. I think he always wanted a quick in and out. And his vision, plan A effectively, was to go in, seize control, then implement a new government that would be Moscow compliant, and then get out. Because if you leave troops on the ground, history has shown us that they will unfortunately become victims of long-running guerrilla warfare. We've seen that everywhere. You know, the Russians were hit in Afghanistan. When Gorbachev, decided to withdraw his troops, then, his advice and warning to, I think it was Bush at the time, when the Americans were looking to go in, was, look, you'll take Kabul in a matter of days, but you could end up spending the next 10 years or so trying to defend it. And that's what he doesn't want. So the cost is twofold here. One is number of dead bodies going back home. And the second is that Russia will just sink deeper and deeper into the mire. So I think his original plan was literally just to do a quick in and out. And in the process, he would maintain some level of conflict and instability in Ukraine. And that, as per my article that I sent out last Friday, was designed really to try and keep commodity prices elevated, because that's all he's got. He has nothing else. I think for the most part, he had sort of more or less assumed the worst in terms of sanctions. Possibly we've gone a little bit further in other aspects. But I don't think being banned from sport and all these events are really going to shake him. But
they're not going to shake him. But again, there's a view that what they are doing is shaking the support of the Russian populace. I mean, despite the propaganda war, you are hearing about larger and larger public demonstrations against the war. And in the context of Russian leadership, that displays a certain level of bravery and courage to speak out and demonstrate against the regime. I mean, that even if you are the thickest skinned leader in the world, at some point that's got to hurt you.
It absolutely, definitely. There are ways of stretching it out. And if he can continue to enjoy good revenues from, from dollar earning assets, then he can always spend that on the population. He's done things in the past around those lines, but eventually exclusion does come with a price. Arguably, we saw this in South Africa. I mean, there are people who said that, why did apartheid really come to a halt? It's because, amongst other things, South Africa was excluded from world sporting events, and that also took its toll. So, yes, it is ultimately, you can't hang on to this forever. But what he is out to do is to transition Russia away from the West and move it to a new alliance. In the West, we might call that new alliance the axis of evil. But it includes other countries there, notably China, who has also abstained.
Yeah.
But it hasn't come out and condemned what he's done. And the announcement between the two leaders on the 4th of Feb, when the Beijing Winter Olympics began, was one of real support for each other. That we're going to take this relationship to a whole new level that no one's ever seen. So I think the focus now has to be on how he exits from Ukraine, and there's no doubt that he's worried because the Ukrainians are putting up such a fight. He still hasn't got control of at least two of the big cities, Kyiv and Kharkiv. And there are reports that the Russians have now taken Kherson, which is near Crimea, but that's disputable, or at least it's being disputed by the Ukrainians. So the options now, in terms of what I see as a plan C, are several. One is that he could just suddenly pull out. That doesn't seem very Putin-like, just to leave like that. He wants to walk with a victory. The alternative is that there is some sort of peace that is brokered, probably by China, but there are potentially other contenders. And that allows for some sort of conditions to be met, whether it's an agreement around Ukraine being neutral, guaranteeing neutrality, both in terms of becoming a member of NATO, as well as EU ascension. That's a distinct possibility, actually, because then in return, they might say, well, okay, you have your own government, but on these conditions. So that's quite possible. But first and foremost, he needs a victory of sorts in Ukraine as part of phase 2, which is this heavy movement that he's now launched. That's really what we have to see in the next steps.
Sorry to ask, what is worst case scenario for you in this situation?
Worst case scenario follows on from the warning that he gave, which I feel has been a bit downplayed, was when he put his nuclear deterrence on alert. That's the worst case scenario, because if he ends up in that situation, as you were just saying earlier, if he ends up with a backlash in Moscow and the whole of Russia, he's not going to be able to contain that. He just can't. We know from history that no leader has ever been able to do that. Then what does he have left to lose? That's the concern that I have. And is he strong enough, mad enough, crazy enough to go ahead and do it? So far the evidence indicates that he is. So we need a resolution here for the whole world.
Yeah. As always, we do welcome your feedback on the podcast. And again, if you'd like to not only subscribe to the podcast, but also get on the mailing list for Jabir's excellent week in review, you can go to this website address or send an email to the address that will be displayed on the screen right now, and you can get added to that list, because it really is thought-provoking commentary. Jabir, near and medium-term implications for Europe, because the timing of this, in terms of the supply of oil and gas, and to some extent, I suppose, wheat, you've identified that. But if we focus in on the oil and gas predicament, this comes at a time when energy prices, as you've explained on previous podcasts, are under greater pressure than they ever have been, soaring costs of living. and in the near term especially set to get even higher if supply is restricted. How does that play out in practical terms? You don't want to bully, but the reality is we have got a bully.
Correct. And I think all of a sudden, just when it looked like energy prices were perhaps beginning to level, suddenly they've now received a leg up. And that instantly, in my mind, spells another round of energy-induced inflation. So in the next set of inflation numbers, watch out for that, because this is the unexpected bit of energy rise that many thought, I thought certainly, that that had gone now. I always felt that the next round of inflation would come through things like wages and shelter costs, i.e. housing related. And I still believe they will. But now what this has done is it's renewed the energy side. So those inflation numbers are not going to be good. Turkey announced its deficit, current account deficit, and it was up a staggering amount year on year. And that's all before this started. And its single biggest import cost is energy. So what's that going to do to the budget balance going forward? This is a common problem everywhere. So there's another issue here as well, and that is that with any country that is seeing its currency depreciate, then automatically they will start to import more inflation. So that's another concern. There comes this moment where you have this double compounding effect. So this is more round of inflation. I think Jerome Powell actually was very clever yesterday in his, I believe it was a Humphrey Hawkins testimony, in which he said that he's still on balance in favor of a 25 basis point hike this month, which was a very clever way of saying that I'm against the 50 basis point hike. Now, that might not sound like much of a difference, but to the market, in terms of optics, that's very meaningful. Now, it's not a done deal yet. Obviously, they've got to take a vote on it, and we'll see how it plays out. But he's essentially said to the market, I'm in favor of just doing this gradually. Meanwhile, around that, if you look at the latest factory activity numbers, they're impressive. So we're coming into this, certainly from a Western perspective, we're coming into this from a position of strength. But there are pressures here which need to be addressed. And I think central banks now will be cautious in terms of the way they hike rates. They will only really get aggressive if it starts to come through in wage pressures. That's essentially the message that seems to be coming out. So it creates an interesting situation in terms of where do you invest? What sort of asset classes do you look at?
Yeah. Just finally, I want to return to information and media and the distribution thereof, and excuse my cynicism here, but we become slightly desensitized to the televising of war. It started in the Middle East, and it's almost become normalized in a way which you can debate the merits of that for the rest of the year. But there has also been, amongst all the major news outlets that I have certainly consumed in looking for information, and perhaps you can confirm if it's the same, it's almost like COVID has disappeared. None of the news outlets are covering their daily COVID numbers like they were. It's almost like there's something new to cover.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I think I would put it another way, and I would say that the days of responsible reporting have long gone. Now it's all about sensational reporting, what grabs the news. And you're absolutely right. COVID, we are very much in the end game. COVID. I mean, there are some exceptions. China still has a zero policy around COVID, and that comes with a price. But generally speaking, certainly in the West, you can see all the curbs, being lifted. And in the UK now, certainly, it's pretty free. I think it is troubling. You're absolutely right. Over the years, it's as if people have developed a thicker skin to adverse news. And you know something, I think that shows itself in the good old market volatility number. Because when I look at that and I track it and I say to myself, okay, in the world today, such and such a thing has happened. Therefore, volatility should spike. And there are many, many times when it doesn't spike, or it only spikes by a little bit. I've noticed that volatility itself, which is a manifestation of that consumer sensitivity to world news, is itself a lower number. It takes something huge to actually make it shift. And that's worrying, because then at what point does a political leader suddenly say, I'm going to have to use something far more dangerous to actually wake the world up?
Yeah, troubling times, but always good to get your views. And don't forget, you can download the Under the Macroscope podcast on Apple, Spotify, or the Google podcast platform for Android, or at our website, www.skyboundcapital.com. And we do encourage the comments, the feedback, the questions. The reason we stepped out of the fortnightly pattern was precisely that. We got a lot of questions and feedback around Jabir's week in review, which focused in quite sharply on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and hence we decided to jump on this call and just expand on those views somewhat. A reminder that Skybound Capital is a company that provides a variety of fund management and advisory services in a number of jurisdictions. Offices in London, where Jabir is, Cape Town in South Africa, where I am sitting for this podcast, also in Hong Kong, Mauritius, Australia. And we are underpinned by an exceptional research team, and it's just wonderful to be able to share some of these thoughts and analytics on what's going on in the world at any given point in time and what is driving different market sentiments. So we do encourage you to join us again for the next edition of Under the Macroscope.